Today, I'm thrilled to be speaking with Zibby Owens, publisher, author, and podcaster who's been called New York City's most powerful bookfluencer. Zibby just released her latest book called Blank, a novel. She's the author of 2 other bestsellers, Bookends, A Memoir of Love, Loss in Literature, and the children's book Princess Charming. Zibby is the creator and host of the award-winning daily podcast, Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. She's the co-founder and CEO of publishing house Zibby Books, owner of Zibby Bookshop, an independent bookstore in Santa Monica, California, and she's the creator of the Zibby-Verse, a community of book lovers for which she offers retreats, classes, special events, a book club, a writing group, and more under the Zibby Media umbrella. In this episode, I talk with Zibby about her inspirations and how this mom of 4 finds time to not only sleep, but also to read books and to create an entire literary universe. I really enjoyed my conversation with Zibby, and I know you will too. And with that, here's Zibby. Zibby, thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming. It's so wonderful to see you. And I, having a real professional podcaster, someone who's much more experienced than I am in my midst, is both exciting and intimidating at the same time. So this is like professional development for me. I'm very, very excited to have you here. I mean, where to begin? You have built truly a literary empire. You are a publisher, an author, a podcaster. You own a bookstore. You've sort of single-handedly created this entire universe for authors and for readers. And I always think it's interesting to kind of understand what inspires guests and where they're coming from. So let's take it back to the beginning. Did you always have a love for books? Where did this passion come from?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me here. This is a joy and fun to be on the other side. Yes, I have loved books forever. Since I first learned how to read, I've been obsessed. I remember reading Charlotte's Web and sneaking into the bathroom to finish it after bedtime and just having like tears stream down my face as I like huddled in my Snoopy nightshirt. And I was like, oh my gosh, books can make you cry. I just was hooked. I was hooked right away. And I feel like books have led me through everything in life. You know, I don't have older siblings, so I feel like everything that's coming next, I read a book, and that's sort of my path forward. I'm reading a lot of aging books right now.
It is really funny, right? I mean, my bedside table is like, it's either a parenting book, a book on aging, self-improvement.
My husband's finally like, can you stop reading so many books about widows? I was like, okay, fine.
He's starting to get worried.
To get worried. He's like, something I should know. But yeah, it's been a lifelong passion. I love it. I love it so much. And it's like a dream. When people are like, you work so hard, I'm like, it's not work. It doesn't feel like work. Even if I wanted to rebel and not work, I would pick up a book.
So it started with the love of reading, and then did the love of writing evolve naturally from that? I guess it does.
That was around the same time, to be honest. I wrote my first short stories when I was 8 and 9 years old, and my grandparents published this little miniature book for me with 2 short stories when I was 10 with my name on the spine and everything. And I was like, oh, this is great. I'll be an author. I don't have to worry about what I want to do when I grow up. But it's been quite a road. I'm 47 now, and finally had my novel come out this year. So, I've loved to write. I think it's so much fun. I've always really been able just to open up a document or flip open a notebook and write very openly and easily. It just comes very naturally to me. So I've had a lot of fun doing that. And ever since I had my first article come out in 17 magazine when I was 14 years old, well, I wrote it when I was 14. It came out when I was 16. But it was about this period of time in my life where my parents had gotten divorced and I had gained some weight, and I felt, I had all these thoughts and feelings about it. And so I wrote it, and my mother encouraged me to send it to 17, and it got published, and they got so many letters back from people it had helped. And I got so many letters that I was like, well, this is great. It's easy for me to do. It helped me. It helped them. I think I'm going to keep going. So.
And you could see sort of how the power of your writing, how it impacts others or helps others. Good for your mom. That is really, because that could sort of, I would think it would give you, at least, for me or anyone else, sort of this great boost of confidence in what you're doing, having it be picked up and then going through that whole process.
Yes.
So when you went on to college, but you went to business school after college, right? So were you, after going through college, did you think you wanted to pursue a career in writing or publishing? Was that your step after, or did you pivot at some point?
I pivoted at some point. I got to college and realized I didn't want to be an English major because I didn't really like all the classes. But in the psychology major, I wanted to take every single class. So I majored in psychology. My first summer of college, I interned at Vanity Fair magazine. And I quickly realized there was like no path from intern to contributor. And that was not the way to go. So I figured I'll just pursue some of the things I'm interested in. I'm interested in a lot of things. And I then interned at like a psychiatric hospital. I worked in the adolescent inpatient unit, and I'm really into brands and the relationship between people and brands and marketing and all of that. So I interned in advertising, and I started work after college in LA at a small brand development and design firm. And then the internet was blowing up, so I joined a company called Idealab, which launched companies. Yeah. And through that, I got to see so many companies start up and what were good ideas and what resources they needed and all of that. And then I worked at Unilever, launching the Vera Wang fragrance back in New York. And then I went to business school.
That's so interesting, though, because all of those experiences, right, I think obviously led up to or helped, support the step that you took later in creating all of the businesses and things that you've done since then, right? Being at Idealab and seeing how that how things would start and get off the ground.
Yes. And all the knowledge sharing too. I mean, I do that now with all the writers. I mean, at the time I was like, my career is so messed up. My resume is all over the place. Why can't I just like be a banker or consultant and have it all be linear? But I'm all over the place. But it turns out every single thing I've done has been helpful to me now.
I remember that same pressure myself in my 20s and I think my answer to that was go to law school, because you can always apply that, that education or training. At least that's what I was told to really anything. But anything that you do, whatever you're pursuing, is giving you an experience that you can apply to whatever else you want to do later. And you obviously, taking those experiences that you had, then obviously going to business school. So after business school, did you get back into marketing, or did you...
So during business school, things took another turn. And by the way, the whole time I was doing that, I was freelance writing. So I was writing for lots of magazines all along the way, and school newspapers, but regular newspapers, and whatever I was sort of into, I would write about different life stages. Like when I got married, I started writing for the bridal magazines. When I was losing weight again, I wrote for like Shape and Self, and then parenting magazines and all the home design. Anyway, I've just been...
So how does that work? You write the article and then you send it into the editor there, or did you have relationships at that point?
I did not really have relationships. I remember emailing like 12 different ideas cold to an editor at Shape and being like, well, let's see if she likes any. And she wrote back and she's like, wow, these are great. Let's start with 5. And I was like, 5? That's amazing. That was so exciting. Yeah. So I pitched a lot cold. For essays, I would write the whole thing and try to sell it. But I also wrote a bunch of how to read on the treadmill. I don't know what I did, servicey type features as well. So I did a lot of pitching. I took a lot of classes. I even took a class on how to pitch better. So yeah. And then in business school, I started out thinking I would pursue this marketing career because I really like marketing and I really like starting up businesses. In fact, I wanted to start a business where I would provide resources so that I could go to like the apartments of all the bankers and the lawyers and everybody who was too busy to wait for Con Ed, and I would like go in and wait for Con Ed and set up their apartments for them. Because I was like, how else am I going to meet all the people who were too busy working? How am I going to meet them? I'd always had like a million ideas of things I wanted to start. So I went to school, and right after I got there, it was 9/11, and my very best friend and college roommate, and who I had been living with in New York before I left, worked in the North Tower, and she died on 9/11. And it changed my whole life. And I literally went from being with her every 2 seconds to, packing up her clothes. And it was terrible and changed my life forever. And it has infused everything I do up to this point. And I think about it all the time because it was a huge shift. It was, if not now, when, and a million other things. But I decided, since I had always wanted to write a book, and in my head, I could literally disappear from the planet at any moment, I might as well do that. So as soon as I graduated, and then I had all these other losses while I was there, it was a really tough 2 years. And I was a bit of a mess. So I said, okay, I'm going to just take a year and do that thing and write that book.
This is
so now I'm in 2003.
And you're in business school.
This is right after business school. I had just gotten to school 2 weeks prior, and we had just said goodbye. I was just on the phone with her. And when I graduated, I decided to take this year off to write a book, and I wrote a book called Off Balance. I wrote like 4 complete different drafts, blah, 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 and got an agent. And then it ultimately didn't sell, which was so devastating and humiliating and embarrassing. And I just didn't think that was even an option, right? Like up till then, I followed the path. I work really hard and I could, you would succeed. It was like a formula, and not in this case. However, my agent hooked me up with these 2 other women, and I did ghostwrite a book. So that was great. Had my name on the cover, whatever. And then I had twins, and I ended up staying home for 11 years. I ended up having 4 kids. I mean, I still have 4 kids, thank God. And stayed home. And I freelanced a little, and I helped friends like start up things. I helped work on this daily deal site for moms that was launching, and like wrote a blog and wrote more essays and things like that. But for the most part, I was doing the mom thing for a while.
Well, I mean, say no more. I have 3 children, 4 children. You had me at twins, actually. So how is it 2018, 2019? You're home at that point. Your children are a little bit older. How did you decide to start the podcast? And the podcast was first, correct?
The podcast was first. What ended up happening is I actually got divorced and suddenly had all this time every other weekend without the kids, which was incredibly hard. And I remember having this therapist at the time who was like, well, with a good book, you'll never be lonely. And I was like, that's true. And then I was in a new relationship with the man who is now my husband. So I wasn't like alone, but it didn't fill the void of not having
your children there,
kids. So it was very emotionally, it was a really tough time. So anyway, I got really back into reading, and I got back into writing finally. And I remember writing this one article. The preschool at the time had sent an email that they needed empty toilet paper rolls for us to bring in to school the next day. And I was like, you know what? This is where I draw the line. I am not going to unspool all the toilet paper around my house so that I can bring in the toilet paper rolls. And I sat down.
It is so true, as if we have egg cartons just like at the ready sitting there. I know.
I mean, like, what do you do with the eggs? So anyway, I was envisioning these just like piles of discarded toilet paper and everywhere. And it just spoke to how many things we were always having to do. And particularly with young kids and as a divorced mom, when I had the kids, I didn't want to spend all day with the forms and this thing to hand in and all the obligations of modern motherhood. I just wanted to like be on the floor and hang out with them and play and have fun and all of that. So I wrote this piece, Mother's Guide to Sanity, something like that. And it went viral on HuffPost. And I was like, oh, this is fun. I do remember how to write. I'm going to keep doing this. And I started writing for a good year. I just wrote essays as I navigated life. And at that time, I was also helping Kyle, who ended up becoming my husband. His family made crumb cakes in Charleston, South Carolina. They were like, maybe we can turn it into a business. And I was like, I can turn it into a business.
Did you?
I did. Yeah, I turned it into a business. We got a logo and LLC and a website, and we were distributed through Goldbelly and had a contract with Whole Foods and went all these markets, and it was great. I got them all this press, and it was a lot. They were, in the kitchen. His mom and sister were like in this commercial kitchen, just night and day, baking for like a year. So I did.
Is that one of those things you can give the formula to someone, or is it one of those things that
they did? They eventually did find a co-packer, but that was hard because they, had to test out so many different places. And it was their grandmother's recipe. So the grandmother would be testing and all of that stuff. And then in another, bad news portion, his mother and grandmother ended up both dying of COVID in the very beginning.
Oh, my gosh.
I know. And we were in charge of their care. I mean, not to just be a downer on this episode, but there's been a lot of loss. Let me just say it that way. That was horrific. So his sister has still been running it, but she has just decided that it's time to say goodbye to the business after it's just too much. So But I did help with that, and I did the writing. And then one night, Kyle said, you should really take all these essays and turn them into a book. And I said, oh, moms don't have time to read books. And then I was like, oh, that's so funny. That's what I'll call my book. So I wrote a whole proposal, which I had done before with my other book. And for the book I sold, the other book called Your Perfect Fit. And I started taking it to agents and anybody in the industry who I vaguely knew. And the advice I got was that I didn't have a platform and it would never sell. It wasn't on social media anywhere and hadn't really been doing that much lately. So one friend then took me to coffee and read the proposal and was like, no, I don't think this is what you're meant to do next. I think you should start a podcast. And I was like, why would I start a podcast? And then at the same time, an agent I met with who suggested I have a bigger platform was interested in another book I wanted to write, which was a novel called 40 Love, about falling in love again at 40. So,
by the way, I love all the names that you've come. I mean, 40
Thank
Love
you.
is so great.
Thank you.
I mean, Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books is so great.
Thank you. Yeah, so that's really why I went home that day when my girlfriend suggested it and Googled how to start a podcast. And I was like, oh, I'll use the title from that book, Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books, and that'll be the title of the podcast since I'm not going to write that book. And I thought I would just start by interviewing authors. Well, actually, to be honest, I was going to read essays that I loved, that I read places and excerpts of books, but then that's actually illegal. So I pivoted and said, okay, I'll try interviewing authors. And I knew 3 authors. And I said, well, I'll just start with them and see what happens. I love talking to authors. So that's what I did. And I just started doing it. And I loved it so much. And that has led to everything else. I started it once a week, went to twice a week. When the pandemic started, I went to daily. So March of 2020 till April of 2024, I released 7 episodes a week. And now I'm trying to go back to 3, but I really kind of still want to do 7. So I don't know. But along the way, I've started a lot of other things, as you know, and it came about slowly. I mean, one thing has led to another, and my own writing has evolved at the same time. So it's funny sitting here with you today. I could never have planned it this way. It's just that it has all happened. And now I feel like I'm at a point where it all happened and yet it was so unlikely. But now all of it happened at the same time. So now my novel's out and my memoir and I wrote a children's book and 2 anthologies and I have a publishing house and a bookstore and da-da-da-da. And it looks like so much, but everything has been very slow and very thought out. And there have been a lot of things that didn't work. And it's been just relentless, incessant work all the time and emailing and posting and building up social media and just not stopping. So that's how I got here.
Earlier, when you read that first book, right, you read the Charlotte's Web and it made you cry. You having that love for what you're doing and that space, right, learning from these other authors. But how do you, I know how much time it takes to find people to interview, read up on what they're doing.
Yeah.
I don't want to put you on the spot, but are you reading all these? The books that you're interviewing the authors about. That there's no what's it called? The yellow Cliff Notes. Yeah. There's no.
I'm actually in my next book. I'm talking all about Cliff Notes because I'm having my character start Jory's notes about. Anyway,
thank God for Cliff Notes because I do love a good read, but I remember some summer reading. The Red Badge of Courage definitely got a Cliff Notes treatment, but. That is a lot of work.
So I don't read every book start to finish. It would be physically impossible. Yeah. But I can prep a book for a podcast in half an hour. It's not, some books I read the whole thing because I'm obsessed or I have the time or it just so happens. But yeah, and then as you said, I have to research them and go to their website and social and da-da-da. And
so when you're starting, you have 3 friends that are authors. Mm-hmm. And then how did it evolve from there? Were they referring you to their publisher or agent, or how did you build your guests?
So my first guest was Lee Carpenter, who was a friend of mine from business school. And I remember her leaving. I did them in my apartment at first, and sometimes I still do. And she was leaving, and she's like, one day you are going to have books piled up here. And I was like, are you out of your mind? Not a chance. She's like, no, this is amazing. Just wait. And now it's true. I get books all the time. She told people. I interviewed one of my first.
She's great, by the way. I love Lee.
Great,
she was on.
yay.
She's been on the podcast.
Oh, good. I'm so glad.
But she's just so smart and wonderful, and it's good to know that her prophecies come true. So at some point, right? People are then going to you. But how long did that take?
Well, a few publicist started coming to me pretty early on, but it took a little bit. I would say a year. I mean, I would get different guests at different points. One of my first guests was Andre Agassi, because my husband used to be in the tennis world, and he had a really good friend who had just been on an airplane next to him. And I was like, oh my gosh, Murphy, could you ask if there's any way he would come on my podcast? And he actually said yes because of Murphy. And that really helped me get guests, is that one of my first guests was him, and it helped the rankings and blah, 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 even though I was like not getting very many listens at the beginning, but I just like kept at it. And the New York Society Library, by the way, I feel like I the word spread throughout the carols there, because one person would come over and do the podcast and go back and be like, oh my gosh, you guys, Zibby has a podcast, you got to go on. And so I got to know this entire community of women authors. And then I started having salon events, because it was Dani Shapiro, the author, who came over to do the podcast. And she said, some people host these salons in their apartment. You should totally do that. And if you want, I'll be your first guest. And I was like, yes, let's do that. So I had her and another author come, and I started doing that. And I did it maybe every 3 weeks. I would have essentially a live podcast, but it wasn't a podcast, where I would combine two guests who had something that I thought would be interesting in common. And I would moderate the conversation and sell the books usually, and then offer food and drinks and just a time for everybody to connect. And I did this essentially like event series for 2 years, and that really helped. And then that led to doing book fairs, where I invited 30 authors at once and sold all their books together, and did like a holiday shopping fair. And that was sort of a precursor to what became the bookstore, where we do have these salon style events. I don't moderate all the time because I'm not there, but we have 2 authors all the time, a couple times a week, and sell the books. So that became that.
I did look at the bookstore, Scott. You have Nicole Avant coming to talk about her book, which I love listening to her on a couple of podcasts talk about that book. But the idea of opening a bookstore, was that something that you always wanted to do? Was that you're thinking about sort of?
I mean, it's something I always wanted to do, but I didn't think I would ever actually do it. I mean, I still pinch myself with the bookstore thing. That, of all the things, that is the one that I still can't believe has happened and is so fun and great and was easier than I thought. I mean, a bookstore is so much easier than a publishing house. I mean, running the publishing house is for sure the hardest thing that I'm doing. But yeah, I always wanted to have a bookstore. And I remember right before the pandemic, I had looked for spaces here in New York with another bookstore owner to see if maybe she wanted to do like a satellite location. And I was like, I only want to do it really close to my house so I could fit it in with like pickups and drop-offs and all of that. And, the rent was crazy, and I just didn't think I could do it. And fortunately I didn't, because that was like right before the pandemic started. So I wouldn't even have been in the store at the right time. But then in LA, I started spending a lot of time in LA, where I lived for 2 years after college as well. When after my divorce, Kyle had never been to LA. So we went out to visit my brother and his wife and 3 kids. And he just absolutely fell in love with it out there. And so did I. And now he's actually I've said actually 100 times. Now he's a producer, and his whole company that he started is based out there. So we spend a lot of time in LA. It's our happy place. And there was a bookstore near us in the Palisades, which left. And Kyle said, oh, you've always wanted to open a bookstore. Now's the chance. Like, the Amazon bookstore is gone. And I was like, oh, come on. He's like, why don't you just see? And I was like, okay. We were sitting outside doing nothing. I was like, I'll call the broker. I wonder how much that spot would even be. And the broker basically laughed me out the door and was like, yeah, right. And it turns out it's now in Yves Saint Laurent. But he said, I do have like a really great space in Santa Monica, and the owner really wants a bookstore. And I didn't even look at it. I was like, it's too far away. Meanwhile, I live in New York City full time.
Yeah.
But like the difference from Palisades to Santa Monica was too much. So at first I didn't look. And then he convinced me, like, well, what about a pop-up? And finally I went and looked at the space, and it was so perfect. And they gave me such a great deal. And I was like, this is it. It was meant to be.
It was totally meant to be.
It was meant to be. And I renovated the whole place. And I called the guy who did our house out there. And I was like, Joe, can you just make this look like it's another room in our house? And I bought the furniture on Wayfair on Black Friday and got some bookshelves and set it up.
So let's talk about timing. So it's 2018, you start the podcast. You're doing 1 episode a week, and then the next year you go to 2, and you're you're writing at the same time.
Yes.
And then the bookstore, you said, is kind of right before COVID. So like 20...
But then I didn't do anything. So I looked into it, but I didn't actually start the bookstore until 2023.
But the Zibby-Verse, doing your salons and getting which I love. I mean, I love all of it. Getting everyone together, that was happening sort of from the beginning.
Yes. 2018, 2019. I had this article come out about me in 2019 in Vulture that called me New York City's most powerful bookfluencer.
Yes.
And that changed everything. Like from then on, I had like 1 million pitches and getting A-list guests and all the rest. So that was a big turning point, I think, professionally with the podcast. Even though in the podcast they said that I had already achieved all of this, then it just like went to a new level.
It's so incredible. And so when did you decide that you wanted to become a publisher? I mean, how did you pivot to that? And
I'm like, why did I do that? No, I'm kidding. What happened is that I started interviewing so many authors, and everybody was saying the same things, that book tours were getting canceled. They were only making 1 or 2 stops. They didn't have any input on their covers. Their editor was barely doing anything. Book sales were impossible. It was just this like steady stream of disappointment, discouragement, and I was starting to get tired of it.
And you had that experience yourself, right, with your first book, or just sort of
I hadn't had a book
like it
come out yet. I hadn't
got
had
off the ground, I guess, or wasn't.
It was hard because I was so longing to have a book come out, and the fact that the authors were here and that they didn't feel appreciated when this is really what I wanted was to like sell this memoir or whatever. It just got to me, and I was like, no, if they get it, they should be celebrated. And like, what's going on? So I just started learning more about the publishing industry and started thinking, well, what could I do? And I tested out, also I started a website that became Zibby Mag, where I had authors write original essays. And that was really fun. So they would write an essay a week and I would publish it, which I really launched during the pandemic, but it had been in the works before. And I loved that. I would get essays by, Lily King, like a doc that nobody had read except me. And I was like, this is so cool.
That's amazing. And that's is that your anthologies?
That turned into my anthologies. So with those, I got a peek at the publishing industry as an author and all the things that I was and wasn't supposed to do, things that were and were not okay, what it was like having one book on a high shelf at a bookstore and being like, no one's ever going to find my book. So I learned a lot about publishing from that experience. And then I had a children's book come out, which just like fell into my lap, and that was fun. But I learned even more about
Princess Charming.
Yes.
So tell me about that.
Yeah, another author. I feel like everything good in my life has been because of the authors. That is really why it all happened. So an author, Karen Ducasse, who had been on my podcast, said her friend who was starting a children's book imprint at Penguin Random House, where she had been forever, called Flamingo. And would I want to do a children's book potentially? And I was like, of course I would. And we had lunch, and she showed me this picture of an illustrated girl. And she said, okay, well, this is a girl named Princess Charming. If you were to write a book about her, what would the plot be? Like, who is she? What would it be about? You want to take a stab at it? And I was like, sure. So
you could do that right on the spot?
Yeah. Well, I was like, she's like, why don't you think about it? I was like, okay. And then we went back to our salads, and then like, I don't know, maybe 3 minutes later, I was like, okay, well, here's what I would do. And she loved it because I basically had a twist that Princess Charming was Prince Charming's little sister under his shadow. And you don't know that, though, till the end of the book.
Right.
Not to give it away, but it's like 5 pages, so it's fine. Anyway, so that taught me a lot about being in a big house, right? That was a huge publishing house and what was that like? And what is that market like? And marketing and discovery and all of that. And because I was really enjoying working with the authors directly, I started a fellowship program for a year. So I had for a year, I worked with 4 authors and 2 editors. And I was like, well, maybe this will sort of scratch that itch that I will help with these manuscripts. But it still wasn't addressing the issues of publishing. So finally, I just was like, maybe I could try it. So I got in touch with this woman Lee Newman, who had already started up a publishing company, and said, like, would she help me do it? And at first she was like, no. And then
no, because she was pursuing her own thing.
She was writing a book. She was like working in Paris. She's like, it was like 2021, like the world was upside down. And she's like, no. But then it was actually by that summer, I went back like 6 months later when things were a little calmer, or maybe I had reached out before. Anyway, but she was one of the editors I had hired to do the fellowship with me. So we'd worked together for the whole year. And then she said, okay, sure, I'll try it. And I wrote the whole, vision and presentation in an afternoon. And we started it.
When was that?
That was in the summer of 2021.
And my gosh. And how many books or how many authors do you have?
Well, so it took a while. So that was when we started talking to agents and editors and everything. That was in the summer of 2021. And our first book came out in February of 2023.
It's amazing.
And we do one book a month in fiction and memoir. So I think we're up to 15 books now. So far, they've all been by women authors, and we have all women on our team except for one guy. Actually, one freelance guy too. So now there's 2. And we have a male author we just acquired. But that's basically what it is. And we work here in New York, and we have a bunch of remote people, and we have a lot of fun and make a lot of books. And now we've had 3 USA Today bestsellers and 2 Book of the Month Club picks and a Target Book Club pick. And it's been really great.
That is, and are these authors that you've had on your podcast, or authors are sending you manuscripts just like they would to any other publishing house? Or I guess agents might be reaching out to you. Right?
It was similar in trajectory to the podcast in that at first it was harder to get. And then as we got bigger and more established, all the agents started pitching. So now we get agented submissions and submissions just from authors directly. 2 of the authors who we've published were prior guests on my podcast. 3 were members of my virtual book club, which I forgot to mention. I started that during COVID, so I have Zibby's book club. So 3 of them I got to know just from being book club members. And I think the rest, one I asked to write a book, basically. And the rest came, I think, through agents. Or actually one woman, Meg Tatey, was someone's cousin. I don't know. It's a mix.
So speaking of books, you just released a book, Blank.
Yes.
Tell me about Blank. Tell me about Pippa Jones. And you can relate to Pippa, I think. You can
Yes, Pippa and I are not so different.
Have you felt like Pippa? Maybe you have, I'm sure, at certain times.
Yes, Pippa is me at my most frantic, on my busiest, most chaotic morning. So I'm very excited Blank came out. First, my memoir, Bookends, came out. That came out in 2022. So I finally got to use the stuff. 40 Love ended up not selling also. But I did write a memoir where I used a lot of my own actual experience instead of fictionalizing it. So that came out first. Again, another taste of the publishing world. And with that editor, I sold Blank on proposal and then wrote it with her oversight, essentially. Blank is about a woman named Pippa Jones, who is a former best-selling author who can't come up with an idea for her next book, or she could come up with it, but her idea ended up being taken at the last minute, so she had to start over. And her son at dinner suggests she hand the book in blank, and as a joke, and she thinks, oh my gosh, that would actually be brilliant. It'll be a commentary on the publishing industry, and it'll be like art, like a piece of art that's blank is actually a commentary on all the art that's come before it. It'll be like that, a conversation piece. So she hands it in blank and turns her world upside down in so many ways. And it's a look inside the publishing world. It's a taste of what's going on behind the curtains, but it's also about friendship. There are 3 really close friends. Pippa has 3 close friends in the book, and they're constantly together. It's about her troubled marriage. It's about her being a mom and just the day-to-day stresses of modern motherhood, going all the way back to that essay. So,
speaking of sort of that kind of pull between, motherhood and us moms kind of pursuing our own passions, I know as you're describing all the things that you've done over the past 5 years, I keep thinking in my mind, how do you find the time? And I know people that are listening are thinking the same thing. So speak to that. And then I want to sort of advice for those that are want to go pursue their passions, but how they can find the time.
I haven't done it all at once. 6 years is a long time when you think about it. It doesn't sound long, but that's a lot of days to be just hacking away at something. Now there are a lot of balls in the air, and I do have 4 kids who are, of course, my top priority, which is why every day I leave work at 2:30 and I go pick them up, and then I work from home in the afternoons. The team works 3 days a week in person, but I only stay till 2:30. And how do I do it? I've hired.
Are you an early? You?
I don't sleep a lot. I don't.
Are you one of those 4-hour sleep people?
I'm not 4 hours, but I don't need that much sleep. And I get up pretty early, and I'm really fast at everything. I read really quickly. I write. I type really fast. Everything moves at a very fast pace, and I really don't get tired that much. I can go on 2 cups of coffee and, just endlessly sort of work. Actually, I'm like, do I have ADHD?
I mean,
Maybe
you see
I
me
have, like,
staring at you
hyperfocus.
like you're Superwoman. I'm like, oh my gosh, what is the secret? Do you have like a vitamin shot? Do you do
No, I just, I feel like I am racing against time. I feel like at any moment, it's all going to end. And it could. And that's how I go through life. Like, can I get it all in until something bad happens? Which I know sounds not like the most sunny reason, but I do feel like I am being motivated by an upside down, what are those things called?
the hourglass.
An hourglass. I feel like I'm trying to outrun the hourglass. The other day, someone was like, "Oh, you've got like 20 minutes until this next appointment. Do you want to like wander around that shopping area and kill some time?" And I was like, kill some time. Like my whole life is like being like a time maximizer. I'm not going to kill time. But now I have people. I mean, I have a team. It's not just me. So I have Anne Massetti, who is amazing, running my publishing company. So I'm there and I go to meetings and I weigh in on everything and I decide a lot of things, but I'm not in the day-to-day management, thank goodness, of every single thing anymore. And the podcast I still do, but I have someone who helps me schedule. And
do you think that's, you mentioned sort of trying to maximize your time until something bad happens. It's informed by the profound losses that you've had, particularly of your best friend. Do you think that's when you said you felt like there was a big shift?
Yep. Yeah. I think it's easy to go through life thinking you have all the time in the world.
Yeah.
But when you've seen that not be the case, I don't know. For me, at least, it has been motivating. And I also, though, have always been like this. Like, I am just, I just am like this. I am always doing stuff and taking on a lot. And I thrive when I'm really busy like this. If I don't have enough to do, I get depressed. So I have to stay super busy. And I like it. Sometimes I go too far and I'm, really stressed and overwhelmed. But if I can just toe the line of having, like, operating at capacity but not overwhelmed, that's like the sweet spot.
So what have you seen? So you've been involved in the broader literary community really since you were a teenager by sending in those articles and then being a freelancer. And how have you seen things change? Or I guess maybe how also are you doing things differently with your community that you've created in your publishing house?
Things have changed so much. When I was at Vanity Fair, there was some big presentation about something called the internet, which might be an issue. And everyone's like, no, it'll be fine.
Y2K. Y2K. I know.
So there are not as many places to freelance or to write essays anymore, which is too bad, right? There's not as much of a path for being a professional writer, journalist. I feel like a lot of the outlets have shrunk. People have had to find their space elsewhere. Like, I have a Substack now, and I'm like, this is great. It's everybody has become their own brand, right? I don't need a magazine. Obviously, I won't get as big distribution, but everyone has to build up their own micro magazines, if you will. So I think of myself as a brand. Like, I am a brand now. I have brand colors and a font and, partnerships and collabs and all this fun stuff. We're partnering with lots of hotels and social goods. We have like a line of sweatshirts and merch and, stationery.
The Zibby-Verse knows no bounds. Knows no bounds. Maybe it's because of social media and the internet, people are able to kind of come together in community, right? I mean, Are you seeing?
Well, that's the other thing. As things have gotten increasingly fragmented, especially in consumption of media, right? It used to be we would all like huddle around and watch 90210, like on our phone, anyway, it was an event, like things you watched and consumed together, and Oprah's book club back in the day and all of that. And I think people long for that. They want to be part of something. And by consuming something creative, artistic, a book, a movie, whatever, it's one way to feel connected when we're all off, spinning around in our own little places, as evidenced mostly during the pandemic when we were literally all just home. So now I feel the pendulum is swinging. Everyone wants to be together again. We've missed that. And books and book clubs are one way of connecting really quickly. I always feel like no two people who have read the same book are strangers, because like we've all had that same kind of lived experience with different characters. So I think books are a connective tissue, but really they're a way to talk about life and talk about ourselves and who we are and find like-minded people. And in a way, it makes the world a lot bigger, but then also a lot smaller because you find your people.
Favorite read right now? And maybe you can't pick one because you have so many incredible authors that you're working with.
That's true. Well, one of the most recent books we've released is called Hereafter by Amy Lynn, which is sensational. It's beautiful. Her meditation on loss after losing her husband. And it is, at age 30, really beautiful. It's tough, but it's beautiful for anyone who's going through grief or has ever gone through it. And then on the total flip side, for some fun stuff.
Yes, summer reads.
Some fun summer reads. I just read a book called The Winner, which I really liked, by Teddy Wayne. That's coming out shortly. Also, I love Summer Romance by Annabelle Moynihan. That is really fun. We have a book called I Want You More coming out by Swan Huntley, which takes place in East Hampton and is like War of the Roses meets Single White Female. And it's really good.
Has someone optioned that yet? They should. That sounds like...
I know, they should. Yeah, we're working on that. So those are a few.
And then you mentioned kind of all the exciting kind of brand partnerships that the Zibby-Verse is embarking upon. But what's next? What's next for you? What's next for Zibby?
What's next for me is I'm writing another book called Overheard, which is supposed to be due at the end of July, which is basically impossible because I don't know how I'm going to get that done, but I guess I just will. And that will come out October of 2025.
Is that fiction too?
Fiction. Mm-hmm. So that's my next book. I'm trying to sell a graphic novel with my daughter that we're writing together, which is super fun. We're doing a lot more partnerships, especially with hotels. I have this secret goal. I want to open a book hotel eventually, but I probably won't. But in the meantime, we're partnering with lots of hotels. And
so partnering so that you'll sort of help put their libraries in or kind of curate. Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah, we're curating a lot of libraries and gift shops and trying to make like bookish experiences. So if there are any hotel people listening and they want to do something. But even we're partnering with a big coffee chain in LA and just like partnering with like-minded organizations. And it's really fun. So I'm loving doing that. We have retreats that we run. We've done 8, and we have a retreat coming up to Palm Springs. We have one in Chicago, and these are for readers, just readers retreats. We pick a beautiful destination or a fun spot, and we bring a bunch of authors together for either a petite retreat like we're doing in Chicago or a weekend retreat. And those are a lot of fun. We have events, we have book club.
And all those retreats are on your website, right?
Everything's on our website, yes, zibbymedia.com. So, and then I'm on Substack, zibbyowens.substack.com, and I'm constantly on Instagram, which is really the biggest time suck of it all, on Instagram at Zibby Owens.
Oh, that's good to know. I'll send you some of my favorite reels, Zibby. I just literally discovered Instagram with the podcast, and all I do is send ridiculous reels to people if I'm not trying to figure out how to post or respond to something. So
you don't have to send me any reels.
No, I'm totally teasing.
I'm good. I'm totally good.
Now you just dared me. I might have to send you one of my animal ones. But anyway, Zibby, thank you so much for coming. So terrific to get to know you and hear about all the wonderful things that you're doing. It's really inspiring. And I know it will inspire many listeners who are thinking that they don't have time to read books, and they do. They do. We all do. We just have to make the time. So
thank you so much for having me.
Oh, well, thank you. That brings us to the end of this episode of The Interview. A huge thank you again to Zibby Owens for joining. And as always, thank you again for listening. If you enjoy the show, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts and follow us on Instagram at The Interview with Leslie. A new podcast is released every Wednesday. Until then, this is Leslie, and don't forget to join The Interview.